Welcome everyone. My name is Ms. Palisa Ramabodu and I am going to be presenting the memo discussion for the April 2021 standardized test, which consisted of 100 marks that was supposed to be written for 2 hours. And I'm going to go through it step by step because it is a selection paper where you choose either or. So let us start. First of all, let us discuss the addendum. The addendum consists of 10 pages, and we have question 1. Well, let me discuss the topics. The topics are as follows. The topics for this question paper, we understand that it is a 100 marks question, which consists of section A and section B. From section A, we have question 1, which is the Cold War topic, origins of the Cold War, and question 2, independent Africa, the case study of Angola. And then for section B, which is the essay questions, we have question 4, extension of the Cold War and the case study of Vietnam, and question 5, independent Africa, the case study of the Congo. So you you have to choose one source-based and one essay. And you cannot go 2 source-based or 2 essays. You have to choose one. So depending on what you've been taught, this is where you get to choose which one you are going to be comfortable answering. So moving forward, we will start with the addendum. And question 1, the addendum states that how did the United States of America react to the creation of spheres of influence by the Soviet Union in the Eastern Europe in 1940s? Now, source 1A, this is the source that elaborates how the Soviet Union, towards the end of the Second World War, started establishing its spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. Now, this is where we get to discuss what Russia's plans and how Russia intended to actually overtake countries that were taken by Hitler during the Second World War. And then moving to source 1B, we have this source is extracted from An Iron Curtain Has Descended speech. Now, this is a speech by Winston Churchill on 5 March 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, in the United States, the USA. It highlights how the Soviet Union had expanded her spheres of influence by spreading communism into Eastern Europe. Now, source 1C, we have the source, which is also a written source. The source is extracted. It must be the policy. Now, this comes from, it must be the policy of the United States to support free people speech. Now, this was a speech delivered by Harry S. Truman on 12 March 1947 in Washington, D.C., United States. It highlights how the U.S. intended to support European countries in order to contain the spread of communism into the Eastern Europe. Now, this is where we get to understand the U.S. perspective in terms of, or the U.S. perspective and the reaction towards the communism spreading across Europe in general. And this is what the source also highlights, what the United States intended to do. What was their recovery plan? How were they going to resolve this? And source 1D is the visual source, a cartoon to be particular. The source is a U.S. cartoon dated 15 January 1948. It is very important that we also understand who drew the cartoon, like which country does the cartoon represent, which was drawn in 15 January 1948. It says, but critical to the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. So you need to have an idea of what the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan is. It suggests that Europe recovery plan to contain the spread of communism was too little, too late. Why? The cartoon is Edwardsville Intelligencer from Illinois, United States. Now, this is where we get to study the cartoon. This is the Marshall Plan towards the European Recovery Plan, which was labeled as too little, too late. And this is the Congress. Now, we are going to go straight into the questions for paper 1, for the first question. And these are the questions. Question 1. Refer to source 1A. I need to highlight this very important aspect before I get into the question, because this is where the memorandum gets to discuss how the question paper is drafted. Now, we know that the source-based question paper is divided into 3 cognitive levels. And these 3 cognitive levels measure or are divided into your mark allocation out of 50. And the mark allocation out of 50 is divided into 3. Now, how does the mark allocation how is the mark allocation divided? We understand that with level 1 questions, these are the type of questions that require you to go straight into the source to go look for answers. And how do we know these questions? These are the questions that says list, mention, name, define, and you select evidence from the source, and they count 15 marks. For level 2, we see that these are the interpreted questions. These are the questions where you get to take information from the source and you interpret it. You don't get to copy these information from the sources. Instead, you have to explain and interpret what the evidence is stating. And they constitute of 20 marks, meaning 40% of your marks are from level 2 questions. And then level 3, this is where you get to interpret and evaluate the evidence from the sources. These are the type of questions that want you to determine whether it is useful, reliable, biased, or are there any limitations from the source. And this is also the type of questions where you have to write paragraph. Now, as they are divided into 3, we are going to go through them one by one. And 1.1.1 says, what, according to the source, was the aim of the Soviet foreign policy with regards to Eastern Europe? I want you to identify this, what, according to the source. So this means already is a level 1 question. The answer to this will be, the answer to 1.1.1, sorry, I'm just going to quickly move. All right. Now, as I had explained, this is an extraction question. The Soviet Union wanted to establish a sphere of influence, if for no other reason than to have and control a buffer zone. So you were supposed to extract this from the source and write it as the source states it. And then for the second question, state 2 countries that objected to the way the Soviet Union established a Soviet buffer zone or a sphere of influence. The answer to this is going to be Britain and United States. And then 1.1.3, explain the implication of friendly governments regarding relations to the satellite states and the Soviet Union. And then the answer is, this is the level 2 question where you interpret the source. No, in fact, level 1, it's level 1. The answer says governments that would be close relations with the Soviet Union and not the US. Number 2, governments supporting communism and not capitalism, or governments that would be led by communists. Any of those responses that are relevant, you give a mark. And then for 1.1.4, identify 2 countries where Soviet influence was well established by the time the Yalta Conference was held. Which 2 countries where the Soviet Union were established? These 2 countries, you mention any 2 countries. Any 2 countries. You mention them: Romania, Bulgaria. You extract, they are there in the source. You just need to understand which 2 countries were established by the Soviets, not established by, the Soviet Union was established there. Now let us go to the questions for source 1B. Now source 1B, quote evidence from the source that suggests that the Soviet Union and its communist international organization operated secretly as they created their spheres of influence over Eastern Europe. Now, the answer to this is that, it's also an extraction question. Nobody knows. The fact that it's a secret, how do we know that it was a secret? Because the source says nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its communist international organization intends to do in the immediate future. Now, that's what the source says. And then the following question, 1.2.2, explain what you think Sir Winston Churchill implied by the statement, "We welcome her, which is Russia, flag upon the seas. Now, 1.2.2, this is where you get to interpret what Winston Churchill means by saying we welcome the flag, the Russian flag, upon the seas. Now, the answer to this, it confirms that the Soviet Union was a superpower. Acknowledgement that Russia was a superpower. Soviet Union was a superpower. The second point, you admit that the Soviet Union had the right to sovereignty. Superpower. And then sarcastic way, it was Winston Churchill's way, sarcastically saying or pretending to respect the Soviet Union while actually critical to their growing spheres of influence. Any other relevance response that shows that the USA was actually admitting that the Soviet Union was a superpower, but in a way of mocking it, saying it using sarcasm. So any other relevant response to that is welcome. And then 1.2.3, explain the concept Iron Curtain in the context of the creation of spheres of interest. Now, this is where you get to define the key concept, Iron Curtain. And then the Iron Curtain here is an imaginary line dividing Europe into West and East after Soviet Union had taken control of the countries in Eastern Europe. The second one, it's a determination by Churchill to draw the line between countries that fell under the Soviet Union through her creation of spheres of influence and protect countries in Western Europe from communist infiltration. Any other relevance response that indicates that the Iron Curtain was an imaginary line or an imaginary buffer line that split Eastern Europe and Western Europe, or Eastern Europe after Stalin had taken those countries that were previously taken by Germany. And then moving on to the next question, we have another extraction question, which is 1.2.4. Name two famous capital cities that, according to the source, fell under the Soviet spheres of influence. Now, you need to mention four. You need to mention two. Wait, I need to see this. Yeah, you need to mention two. And the answer here is Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. Any of those two is accepted because it's an extraction. And then 1.3.1, which is referring to source 1C, is, where is it? Oh yeah, here it is. State two ways through which the United States intended to offer aid to free people who were resisting subjugation by outside pressure. This is what the memorandum says: economic and financial aid. And then 1.3.2, comment on the implication of Sir Harry Truman's statement, "The world is not static and the status quo is not sacred," regarding the developments around the creation of spheres of influence in Eastern Europe after World War II. The answer to this one is, while change is acceptable, the United States would not allow it to disturb what they regarded as peace. Other answer, you can also say the changes brought about by the Soviet Union's creation of spheres of influence would not be accepted. And the other one, the changes brought about by the Soviet Union's creation of spheres of influence rendered principles of the United Nations worthless, which was unacceptable for world peace. And then the USA will stand up against infiltration of communism into Western Europe, and state of affairs created by Soviet Union would not be accepted. So any of those two that are relevant are also accepted. 1.1.3, explain why the collapse of Greece as an independent state would have a profound effect on profound effects to other similar countries. And the memo here states that if Greece fell to communist, it will mean end of her independence. The other answer you could have also said is, if Greece fell to the Soviet Union, the road for communist infiltration into Western Europe would be opened. And then the other one is, if Greece fell, the rest of Western European countries would follow the domino effect. And so any other relevant response that says if Greece were to be attacked by or were to be taken by communism, then this means that the other countries of Europe would also fall threat to the communist influence. And then 1.3.4, the question says, well, explain whether a historian would find this information useful when dealing with the creation of spheres of influence of Europe due to the Cold War that emerged in the Second World War. Now, the answer to this one, it is taken from a speech. So it is useful because it is taken from the speech that was written by Harry S. Truman, President of the United States at the time. And then the speech was delivered. The fact that you say it is a speech, meaning this is a primary source. These are the direct words of Harry Truman. And then the speech was delivered in 1947 when the Cold War started, meaning after the Second World War. So this is information we understand it happened immediately after the Second World War. And then the speech resulted in the formation of the Truman Doctrine, which became the U.S. policy to protect Western Europe from being taken over by the communist influence or the communist ideology. And then it was an official U.S. response to counter the creation of spheres of influence by the Soviet Union. Any other relevant response would also be, it was U.S. response towards the spread of communism in Europe, or USA feared the spread of communism in Western Europe, so it was their recovery plan or their economic plan to stop the spread of communism in Western Europe. And then we are going to go to 1.4.1, that says it's source 1D, which is the visual source. Explain the message being conveyed in the cartoon. Use the visual clues, too little, too late in the cartoon to support your answer. And the answer are as follows. You get to interpret the cartoon because it's a visual source. They want you to explain the message, too little, too late. Now the answers go as follows. It suggests that the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan were not a success. It shows Marshall asking for the implementation of the European Recovery Plan, but the Congress does not seem interested. The potential recipients of the European Recovery Plan believe it's too little, implying that it would not be enough, meaning the Marshall Plan, the money that was given to these countries was not enough. And then too late would also suggest that it would be too late to revive the already collapsed economy of Europe. Any other relevant response that shows that the Marshall Plan was not a success because the money was too little to assist the entire Europe, or too little, or it came very late when Europe had already collapsed. And then 1.4.2, it says, what do you think is the importance of the presence of the U.S. Congress in this cartoon? Now, the answer here is the Congress was responsible for approving any funding requested by the state, and then the Congress represented the parliament body to authorize funding to the Marshall Plan. Any other response that says that the Congress represented the parliament of the USA. And then 1.5, this is a comparison question, and I mentioned that comparison questions is the level 3 questions. This is also where your marks are because it's 2 times 2. Refer to source 1C and 1D. Explain how source 1D differs from source 1C regarding the effective implementation of the U.S. Marshall Plan in Europe. This is where you get to state the contradiction between the two sources. And it goes as follows. You say source 1C is a part of a direct source from a speech presented by President of the USA in his adoption of the Truman Doctrine that was positive. It was positive about the U.S. participation, while I want you to identify the conjunctive word. While source 1D, while states the contradiction in the next statement. While source 1D is a product of a perspective of a cartoonist who suggests that the implementation of this Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan was negative, meaning source 1C is a positive perception of the implementation of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and while source 1D is a negative perception of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The implementation of these recovery aids was negatively painted. And then, or you can say, in source 1C, Truman commits the U.S. to provide economic and financial aid to European countries, but, or while, conjunctive words. But in source 1D, the promise for aid is regarded as too little, too late. Then again, the first source 1C, it is portrayed in a positive light, that this is what the USA intends to do. This is what the USA is going to implement to assist these countries to stop the spread of communism. However, in source 1D, it shows that the money or the financial aid that the US provided was too little, too late. And then in source 1C, President Truman spoke as if getting government funding would be simple. But in 1D, the Congress, the representation of Congress, from which the funding should be approved, seemed uninvolved. So any other relevant response that shows that for source 1C is a positive representation or a positive outlook on the Truman Doctrine, and then source 1D says the opposite because the Congress was not involved, the money was little, and it could not assist to stop the spread of communism. Now, the paragraph question of 1.6, it says, using the information and in relevant sources, not all sources, it's not a must, and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines, 80 words, explaining how the United States of America reacted to the creation of sphere of influence by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe in the 1940s. Now, what is the central or the key message? How the United States of America reacted to the communist influence and the creation of spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. Now, the answers here: American and Britain members of the Control Commission complained of not being able to find out what was being done in their name in countries where communism took over. Sir Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech to pronounce his assessment of the situation and the intention to counter or to curb the spread of communism. This comes from source 1B. Churchill exposed the extent of communist infiltration in Eastern Europe by naming capital cities that had been taken over in order to call for British support in containing the spread of communism. And then the Truman Doctrine was also meant to curb the communist infiltration into Western Europe, which comes from source 1C. And Truman promised to take immediate and resolute action against the creation of spheres of influence by Soviet Union. This information comes from source 1C. And then the U.S. reaction is depicted as too little, too late in source 1C. Any other relevant response? These are the answers that are coming from the source. So if you mix it up, that the communist country, Soviet Union, spread its influence in Eastern Europe, and because the USA feared the spread of communism, they feared the domino effect. They came up with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan to curb the spread of communism in Western Europe. And now, for level 1, it shows that you didn't demonstrate, like you demonstrated little understanding of how the United States applied containment policy in Eastern Europe, and you qualify for either between 0 and 2 marks. And then for level 2, the evidence is mostly irrelevant. To a great extent, meaning you show understanding of how the United States of America applied containment policy in the Eastern Europe in the 1940s. Now, the marks here ranges from 3 to 5, and then level 3, you demonstrate thorough understanding of how the United States of America applied the policy of containment. So we are done with question 1. We are going to jump straight into question 2, which is what factors contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War in Angola between 1974 and 1976. I'm going to go straight into the addendum. The first source, 2A, it says the following source about Angolan peace talks was written by a United Nations consultant, Dr. Fernando A. Gr12. It focuses on how different liberation movements in Angola were supported by foreign countries. There were three different Angolan organizations: the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA. So the source addresses that, the peace talks that took place with regards to what's going to happen to Angola becoming independent. And then source 2B, the following extract explains the circumstances under which the Alvo Agreement was signed by the three Angolan liberation movement on 15 January 1975. Now, this source definitely is explaining after the Alvo Agreement that how is Angola going to be governed by all three of these parties until the elections were going to take place in November. And then source 2C, the source explains the ethnic nature of the Angolan civil war and the subsequent failure of the coalition agreements. Now this explains the actual war taking place, the reasons of the war, and why the war actually took place. And then source 2D, the source is a map of Angola showing main tribal grouping aligned to the three liberation movements. So we've got the FNLA, we've got the MPLA, and then we've got UNITA. And we know that UNITA was under Ovimbundu, and MPLA was under Mbundu, and FNLA was under Bakondo. Now, going straight into the questions, source 2A, refer to source 2A, 2.1.1. Quote evidence from the source that suggests that the liberation movements in Angola were not well trained and properly coordinated. Now, the answer to this one is they did not have sophisticated fighting machines, and they were little more than a collection of small guerrilla units that had rarely seen the comrades, let alone fought alongside them. So any one of those answers, remember the type of level that is required. This is an extraction question, so you need to extract the information from the source. And then question 2.1.2, which is also a level 1 question. State two liberation movements that worked together and turned against the MPLA during the Angolan Civil War. Now, what are those two countries that were involved? We see that it is the FNLA and UNITA. Extraction. 2.1.3, we see, what do you think? What do you think? What is the question? What do you think? What do you think wants you to go and answer according to your understanding? They need your opinion. What do you think influenced the U.S. support for FNLA? What are the reasons, actually? What the question is saying? Why did the United States become involved, and why did it support the FNLA? The answer right here is that the FNLA supported capitalism, which was an ideology of the United States. And then FNLA represented the interest of the U.S. as well as Angola. And then the FNLA was opposed to communism. So meaning we go back to what? The proxy war. The United States wants to get involved because they are now battling against stopping the spread of communism inside Angola. And then 2.1.4, we have give one way indicating how MPLA, supported by foreign powers, give one way. And the response to that, they received major arms shipment from the Soviet Union. They got 27 ship boats. Shiploads arrived in 30 to 40 air missions, were flown to deliver war equipment, and then the first Cuban military advisor began to arrive in Angola around the 7th of May, 1975. The primary task of this contingent group was to set up and run training for the MPLA's military arm. Now, this question also is an extraction question that also wants you to Go look for answers in the source, and also it wants you to understand, it wants you to highlight the USSR's involvement in Angola. Now, going to the second source, source 2b, what, according to the source, quickly broke down the Alvo Agreement? It's a level 1 question, directly from the source. Trust. Trust is what broke the Alvo Agreement. 2.2.2, explain the concept civil war in the context of the 3 liberation groups in Angola. Now, civil war means that it is a war amongst liberation movements in Angola, namely the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA, in an attempt to lead the government as Portugal withdrew colonial power in 1975. Or it is a war amongst Angolan liberation movements that escalated into a Cold War or a proxy war due to foreign assistance. So they want you to answer the key concept civil war in the context of Angola. This is where you need to include that it is a war, or it was a battle fought between 3 liberation movements in Angola, in one country, that escalated to being a proxy war, as it was supported by the superpowers, Cold War superpowers. And then 2.2.3, the question says, using the evidence in the source and your own knowledge, explain why the crisis in Angola developed into a Cold War battleground. Because foreign powers representing capitalism and communism became involved in the Angolan civil war. The foreign powers were attracted by economic interests in Angola, and then Portugal had quickly withdrawn her troops, leaving a vacuum. And then any other relevant response to why these foreign countries started to becoming interested in fighting the war in Angola. You can also state that this was a proxy war. USA became involved in the war because they wanted to prevent the spread of communism, and communism, or USSR, joined the war because they wanted to assist the MPLA to fight or to spread communism. 2.3, it's study source 2A and source 2B. Explain how the two sources support each other with regards to disunity amongst the Angolan liberation movements during the civil war. Now, you need to identify the similarities between these two sources with regards to the liberation movements after the Alvo Agreement, and or you need to identify these two countries, these 3 liberation movements, or based on the two sources, how they support each other. Now, the answers here is that source 2A explains that different liberation movements operated like units that had not fought along each other. That, according to source B, was because they were based in different parts of the country along tribal lines. And then the other one, source 2A, refers to how arms race amongst the liberation movement led to a civil war, which, according to source 2B, came about because of breaking down of trust. And then you can also say both indicate that they were supported by foreign powers. And then let's jump right into source 1D, source 2D, source 2C. What, according to the source, led to the continuation of the civil war after Angolan independence? The answer is, as a result of reluctance of the dominant liberation movement to share power within a multi-ethnic group. This is an extraction. You were supposed to get this directly from source 2C. And then 2.4.2, the question says, identify ethnic groups that supported 3 nationalist movement which had been fighting for Angolan independence since 1960. The answer there is, sorry for this, the answer here is Mbundu was for the MPLA, Mestigos was for MPLA, Bakongo was for FNLA, and Ovimbundu was for UNITA. So any of those 3, that is going to indicate which tribe represented which organization. is also accepted and is regarded as correct. And then 2.4.3, according to the source, this is also another level 1 question, what according to the source made UNITA to attract the largest support in Angola? The answer to this one is the Ovimbundu ethnic group, although geographically fragmented, were largely integrated into colonial society. This is an extraction question. Now, jumping to 2.4.4, explain how Angolan power sharing arrangements and agreements collapsed in 1975. And the answer is Portugal withdrew in 1975. That's number 1. There was a lack of trust amongst these liberation movements and failure by the Portuguese colonial government to hand over power to any one party. Portuguese armies excited Angola and left the country and its future to its own devices. And then the common anti-colonial goal was abandoned, and the 3 dominant liberation movements began a steady struggle for power. And then UNITA formally declared war on the MPLA. So any other relevant response that goes hand in hand with the above discussed answers should be credited marks. And then 2.5, which is source 2D. Now we are going to explain the visual source, which says explain the main message conveyed by the source. And it says it shows the leaders of the 3 liberation movements were the leaders of these 3 liberation movements were, and the liberation movements were based on ethnic and tribal groups. It also shows that the distrust amongst liberation movements emanated from tribal and regional differences. So you can also say, any relevant response can also say it shows where the roots of the Civil War stemmed from the mistrust and tribal differences that the country already had before. And then 2.5.2, using their source and your own knowledge, explain why it was easy for Angola to plunge into a civil war. It says because of tribal and ethnic differences, the leaders of the liberation movements did not work together, and because of mistrust, any other relevant response, because they were 3 liberation movements with 2 different ideologies, economic ideologies. It was impossible for them to not get into a war. And the other thing you can also add there, because these 3 liberation movements did not trust one another. 2.5.3, comment on the limitations of this source to a historian doing research in the Angolan Civil War in the 1970s. And the response there is, the source is dated 1960, earlier than the beginning of the Civil War, which was 1975 and 1976. The neighboring countries are not labeled to provide a regional view. It links the links of provinces with tribal groupings are not indicated. So this question required you to look how limited is the source for you to understand what was the reasons that these 3 liberation movements went to war. Now I'm going to go to 2.6, which is a paragraph question, and it says using the information in the source, using the information in source 2C and 2D as well as your own knowledge, write a paragraph of 8 lines explaining the factors that contributed. Now this is where you are given to use 2C and 2D. They're not saying any other relevant sources for you, but they're specifically picking out source 2C and 2D, as well as your own knowledge, to write a paragraph explaining the factors that contributed to the civil war breaking out in Angola between 1974 and 1976. The 3 main military movements had been fighting Angolan independence since the 1960s, did not fight as a united front against the colonial Portuguese regime. This comes from source A, 2A. And then the arms race amongst the liberation movement for control of power. This is one of the reasons. The failure of the Alvo Agreement to provide for a three-way power-sharing government. The involvement of foreign powers by supporting rival liberation movements. This comes from source 2A and 2B. And then Angola's resource wealth became a means of funding the ongoing war between MPLA and UNITA. Peace or elections supervised, not supervised. And then UNITA was motivated to think they could lead the government because of a large support from Ovimbundu ethnic group, and then reluctance by liberation movements to share power. And then power struggle amongst the liberation movements. And the three dominant movements were based along the tribal lines. And then provinces based on tribal lines along which liberation movements were based. This comes from source D. And then any other relevance response that indicates that you understand why Angola entered or plunged into a civil war between 1974 and 1976. So I'm going to take a quick break, and after, when I come back, I am going to go through the essay questions. I will be back. Hi, welcome back. As I previously said, I am going to jump onto the essay questions of section B. And I had said the questions are divided as the extension of Cold War, which is question 4, the case study Vietnam, and question 5, which is independent Africa, the case study the Congo. I'm going to start with the Vietnam case study. And now the question says, explain to what extent United States of America failed to contain the spread of communism in Vietnam in the period 1965 and 1975. Now the memo goes as follows. Now you are expected in your introduction to take a line of argument, and by indicating to what extent the United States failed to contain the spread of communism. Already you are being told that the USA failed to contain the spread of communism. How did the USA try to prevent the spread of communism? That should be also in your essay. In Vietnam, in the period. Now, elaborating in your essay, the United States involvement in Vietnam War was to contain the spread of, this is the main thing. USA tried to curb the spread of communism in Vietnam. And then between 1957 and 1965, the US supported the South Vietnamese government against the Viet Cong from a distance. And then after the death of President Kennedy in 1963, President Johnson took over and came up with a hardline approach. In 1965, 3,500 the first official U.S. combat troops were sent to support the South Vietnam Army to avoid being taken over by the communists. Now, this is the policy of escalation, where Johnson sent over troops and the number of troops started increasing. And then from March 1965, 3,000, no, I had already read this. The USA thought their technological superiority would end the war in Vietnam, by all means necessary, but it couldn't. And then the war was not a conventional war. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics to defend their country, which confused and led to heavy losses of the U.S. Army. In response to the USA began with Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965, a bombing mission from March 1965 to destroy North Vietnamese. This was a failure. This was a huge failure. And then the other strategy that the USA used was the Tet Offensive of 1968, where the Viet Cong launched a surprise guerrilla attack on South Vietnam towns and American bases. They captured about 80% of them. And then the role of media and the anti-war movement regarding the USA's involvement in Vietnam. And then the communist from North Vietnam, the Viet Minh, provided supplies to South Vietnam through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Operation Ranch Hand in 1968, the U.S. used chemical defoliants such as Agent Orange and napalm to destroy the forest, and Agent Blue to destroy the agricultural products. In response to the Viet Cong, use unconventional tactics and strategies to challenge the U.S. incursion in Vietnam. And then the failure to defeat these guerrilla enemies influenced Johnson's decisions to stand as president again. And then in 1960, not to stand as president again, sorry. And then in 1969, Richard Nixon won the elections with a promise to end the war. And then by 1973, a ceasefire was agreed upon. USA, the North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And then 1973, the Vietnamization took place, where the Nixon doctrine was a secret plan to bring an end to the war, whereas the U.S. troops would be withdrawn from Vietnam, but they were going to be left with militarization. And then in 1975, Saigon, South Vietnam, fell to communist North Vietnam. Any other relevant response? Now, here, remember that it is highly accepted that you mention the strategies of the USA, basing every single paragraph, or not all paragraph, if I must say so, with your line of argument that those strategies that USA implemented were their measures to try and prevent the spread of communism. That is the line of argument that you're supposed to state in every paragraph. However, the Viet Cong were strategic. They used guerrilla tactics, and they were successful in eliminating and to be invisible in the eyes of the USA as well as the South Vietnamese army. Now, going to the question 5, which is Angola, which is Congo. This is the question. Mobutu Sese Seko's leadership qualities after attaining independence from colonial rule in 1960 demonstrated poor political and economic policies. Now, if they say they demonstrated poor political and economic policies, meaning Mobutu Sese Seko, with his leadership qualities, he failed to uplift Congo politically and economically. And then they asked, do you agree with the statement? Let us discuss according to the memo. Now, you here, as a candidate, you should agree or disagree that Mobutu Sese Seko's leadership qualities led to poor political and economic policies for the country after attaining independence from colonial rule in the 1960s. And then candidates should include the following aspects in their response. You should establish a line of argument with regards to whether you agree or not. So you're supposed to take a stance. That line of argument will be sustained throughout your essay if you agree that his policies were a success, or if you disagree that they were poor. And then in elaboration, the political policies. Attaining independence throughout democratic elections happened in 1960s, and then J. Kasavubu became president, and P. Lumumba became prime minister. After holding multi-party elections at independence, the Congo became a one-party state within the first 5 years after gaining independence. And then Mobutu emphasized the importance of Africanization, and he established a one-party state. Opposition leaders were silenced. And then Mobutu Sese Seko remained as president for life until his death in 2007. And then Mobutu Sese Seko created a kleptocracy where a group of appointed public officials abused their positions for financial gain. He built himself palaces. He established a strong centralized government under the authoritarian rule. Family members were appointed to prominent military positions, and any other relevant response. Based on the answers here, it does not look like it was a success. So careful on how you chose to take a stance. And then economic policies. Mobutu relied heavily on primary activities, agriculture and mining, and then but he was unable to develop credible manufacturing sector. And initially, he nationalized industries, policy of Zionization that failed dismally, and he adopted capitalist economy. During his term of office, there was no significant increase in people's living standards, and there was a decline in the state of infrastructure and application of retrocession, reversal of Zionization, and he experienced a variety of economic crisis and consequently relied on foreign aid, and he accepted aid, investment, and financial support from the West, USA, and France. He created a new elite class of supporters, and he had personal investment in majority of European countries. And he became one of the richest leaders in the world at the expense of his own people's welfare. So you were supposed to take a stance and sustain it throughout the essay. And based on these elaboration points, it does not look like Mobutu Sese Seko successfully built his country after attaining independence. Like, his leadership qualities were poor politically and economically. That is it from me. I hope that this memo discussion is helpful, and it's going to take you through in preparation for other assessments throughout the year. Thank you.